Understandest what thou readest in the King James Version? 5 false friends that start with D in 5 minutes. Okay, I'm probably not telling the whole truth about how many minutes this will take. I'm probably not going to try to be that efficient. In fact, I'm just giving up now. I'm like the preacher who says, as we draw things to a close, 22 minutes before he ends. False friend number 88, discover. This word occurs 35 times in the King James. The King James translators used this English word to translate about 6 Hebrew words and 2 Greek words. I think that every single instance of this word in the King James is a false friend. Let me pick an Old Testament example that's kind of funny. Deuteronomy 22:30. A man shall not take his father's wife, nor discover his father's skirt. What do you think that means? Please pause the video and tell me. What does it mean to discover your father's skirt? Feel free to take time to look at the context too. Thanks for doing that. Now, the Hebrew there does not mean discover. It means uncover. But what this really sounds like in our English is that if a father keeps a woman's skirt hidden in a drawer somewhere, kids shouldn't go looking for it. To discover something in our English is to find something or someone unexpectedly or in the course of a search. So did the King James translators get this wrong? No. In 1611, discover generally meant to expose to view something hidden or previously unseen, to allow to be seen, to reveal, to bring to light. The Oxford English Dictionary says that this sense is now rare, chiefly archaic and literary in later use. So, he will discover thy sins in Lamentations 4:22 doesn't mean God is going to find out Edom's sins. It means he's going to uncover those sins, to reveal them to the world. When we had discovered Cyprus in Acts 21:3 doesn't mean that Luke and Paul found a piece of land that civilization had yet to reach. It meant that they caught sight of it. Luke and Paul did not plant the Christian flag on Cyprus and claim it for the church. They just saw it. That's actually yet another sense of discover that we don't use that can be found in the Oxford English Dictionary. Debate thy cause with thy neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another. That's Proverbs 25:9. Doesn't that make better sense now? In our English, you can't discover something to someone else. Clearly, it has to mean reveal. We have false friend number 88. And speaking of debate, that's false friend 89, the second false friend starting with D that we'll do in this video. In Proverbs 25:9, the Hebrew word translated debate is a little more specific than our modern sense of debate. It means basically to take a case to court. I'm not sure this instance is a false friend, Proverbs 25:9 debate, though it may be. There are edge cases. But in Romans 1:29 and 2 Corinthians 12:20, Paul lists debate among other vices, other sins. He describes the wicked as being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers. And he says to the Corinthians, I fear lest when I come I shall not find you such as I would, and that I shall be found unto you such as ye would not, lest there be debates, envyings, wraths, strifes, backbitings, whisperings, swellings, tumults. What are debates? I mean, this may seem so basic, but humor me. Pause the video and tell me what you think Paul is forbidding here with this word debates. Thank you for doing that. Now, I just had a debate, and I know plenty of Christians who have done debates in school. Many Christian scholars have done debates with non-Christians in order to defend the truth of Scripture. Were they sinning? Was I? Is it wrong to have a debate? The Greek word in both places means strife, discord, contention. But the word in modern English seems to be not quite so harsh. A debate may turn into discord, which is why I crossed certain potential debate opponents off my list. They showed in various ways that they couldn't keep their cool and have a reasoned debate like Dan Hafley did. But you have a debate rather than a shouting match because it takes a formal discussion on a particular topic in a public meeting or legislative assembly in which opposing arguments are put forward to make progress on some issues. Did the King James translators get this wrong? Why would they translate a word meaning contention with the word meaning formal public discussion on a particular stated topic? It's because debate used to mean something harsher, or at least to be able to mean that. The Oxford English Dictionary reveals that the noun debate used to be able to mean strife, contention, dissension, quarreling, wrangling, a quarrel. At debate meant at strife, at variance. This use is now obsolete or archaic. We have a false friend. Next time you're doing your devotions in the King James and you come across this word debate, you'll hopefully remember what Paul was referring to. And speaking of devotions, our third false friend, starting with D, is devotions. This word occurs just once in the King James in Acts 17:23. Paul says to the Athenians, "For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you." What are devotions? Would you pause the video yet again and make another comment, please? Tell me, when Paul saw the Athenians' devotions, what do you think he saw? Thank you for doing that. The Greek word here doesn't actually speak of the actions of humans. It speaks of the objects of their reverence. Follow me here. A devotional object, like a statue of Mary or a saint in a Catholic church today, or like any number of statues in ancient Greece that people worshipped. This might be hard for us to wrap our minds around because devotions in our English are definitely things that people do, like prostrating themselves or offering prayers or incense. To most modern evangelicals like me, of course, devotions are something you're supposed to have every day. It's a set of acts of worship that include especially praying and reading your Bible. The Contemporary Dictionary defines devotions as prayers or religious observances. There's a definite difference here between the Greek word that Paul used and the English one the King James translators used. Again, one speaks of objects of devotion, that's the Greek word, and the other, the English, speaks of actions of devotion. Did the King James translators make a mistake? No. The Oxford English Dictionary reveals that devotion could once mean an object of religious worship. They say this sense is now obsolete. The Oxford English Dictionary lexicographers acknowledge that this sense is doubtful. They seem, in fact, to be driven to this precisely because the meaning of the Greek word in Acts 17:23 just can't be speaking of acts of piety. It speaks of objects of piety. The Oxford English Dictionary lists this very verse under this sense. The alternative really is to say that the King James translators got this wrong. And I say they didn't. The other use of this Greek word in the New Testament, they translate precisely as something that is worshipped. That's 2 Thessalonians 2:4. They knew what this word meant. Yes, it's possible that the men who translated 2 Thessalonians weren't the same as those who translated Acts 17, but I trust the King James translators too much as a group to believe that they erred here. I think the OED is right to guess that they intended a subtly different sense of devotions than was common even in their own day, and that what they have produced, the King James translators, has become a false friend in our day. Did the plowboy, the very vulgar of 1611, understand this use of the word devotions? The OED holds out hope that some did. I don't know. It is possible that this is a word that hardly any King James readers have understood for centuries, aside from those who read Greek or read commentaries written by those who can read Greek. On balance, however, I'd prefer to call this a false friend. Speaking of disputes, that's our fourth false friend starting with D for today. This one is subtle. I'm sure enough about it that I'm making it number 91 on my list of 50 false friends, but those inclined to dispute me might as well start here. This was sent to me by an astute viewer. Now, several of these examples in this video were, and please forgive me for not naming their names, they don't always want me to. This viewer noticed that Acts 19:9 in the King James Version sounds a little odd. Out of all the major English translations I check all the time, only the King James, the Geneva Bible, and Tyndale use the word dispute in this verse. But when divers, that means various, were hardened, and believed not, but spake evil of that way, the Christian way, before the multitude, he departed from them and separated the disciples, disputing daily in the school of one Tyrannus. What did disputing daily mean? Pause the video, tell me what kinds of actions that would describe. Thank you for doing that. However, let's examine this. The Greek word here means to engage in speech interchange, converse, discuss, argue. Whereas the word debate in our English is softer than the meaning of the Greek word that's translated debate in the King James, here we've got the opposite, a word that's softer in the Greek than it is in the English, dispute. My contemporary dictionary nails it. To dispute is to argue about something, to discuss it heatedly. Is that what Paul was doing in the school of Tyrannus? Was he the original social media warrior using the Facebook of his day to stir up trouble? Was he vehement? The King James itself translates this very Greek word in Acts 18:4 with a less severe word. It says that Paul reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Now that's perfect. That's what the word means. So did the King James translators get it wrong at Acts 19:9? No, this is again disputable, but there are softer senses of the intransitive verb dispute that can be found in the OED. Maybe the King James translators had in mind to move or influence by disputation, to argue into or out of something. That sense is now obsolete, but it fits the context very well in this chapter of Acts. Maybe they were actually borrowing from a transitive sense, to maintain, uphold, or defend an assertion, cause, etc., by argument or disputation, to argue or contend that something is so. That sense, too, is marked obsolete. Sometimes I get to the end of a study of a potential false friend, and I'm not perfectly certain whether I have one or not. Sometimes I can't be absolutely sure I've correctly read the minds of the King James translators, despite all my years of effort in learning how to do so. They didn't have the OED in hand, of course. It's also possible that the King James, Geneva, and Tyndale were all just influenced by the Latin Vulgate, which actually uses the word disputo. But when not a single contemporary English version uses the King James word, even those versions that are light revisions of the King James, I tend to think we have a false friend. What's the difference here, you might well ask? Not much, I acknowledge. But speaking of difference is the fifth and final false friend, starting with D in this video, and it's the 92nd false friend on my list of 50 false friends in the King James. It's how we'll end this video. This is a definite one, and to introduce it to us, I must invite my friend and debate opponent, Dan Hafley. I almost used this clip in the debate, but I backed off. I'm not here now to mock him. He's a friend. I think he'll respond humbly to this because I myself most assuredly got tripped up by this false friend for years. Can you catch it? Listen to this clip from a Dan Hafley sermon at his church and tell me what Hafley gets wrong. Tell me what making a difference means.
Look what he says in verse 22. And if some have compassion, making a difference. Make a difference in their life. Can you look around at people and say, I made a difference? Tony, God bless you, Tony. Tony's been encouraging me this week. Come in tonight and he was encouraging me. And he was telling me how much this church has made a difference in his family's life. And he wants to give back. What a blessing. I'm going to say to you, all of you folks that have helped Brother Tony and his family, that's what it means. Make a difference, right? He said, this is a working church. That's what he told me the other night, right? It's a working church. You guys are working. You're doing things. Well, that's what we're talking about. Keep yourselves in the love of God, and with some, make a difference. Don't just stand there and say, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled. Right, Lana? Give them food. Send boxes full. Help them. You need gas money? Help them. Make a difference.
Pause the video, please. Give me an explanation of what you just heard. Okay, onward. This one is rather complex, and I'm actually not going to dive into all those complexities because some of them are text critical. There is a textual variant here that scholars are divided over, but I'm going to appeal only to the Textus Receptus, and as usual, I'm not going to posit that the King James translators did anything wrong. I'm going to presume their competence. The Greek word here in Jude can mean to conclude that there is a difference, make a distinction, differentiate. It's used that way in Acts 15:9, for example, when Peter points out to the Jerusalem council that the Holy Spirit put no difference between Jews and Gentiles, but purified the hearts of both by faith. In other words, the Spirit made no distinction. That's what this verb means. But that's not what making a difference means to us, right? It means what Dan Hafley said it means, to have a significant effect on a person or situation, a positive one. My dictionary gives the sample sentence, the scholarship fund had made a difference in a lot of people's lives. I already said that the King James translators did not get this wrong, but it sounds like they did at this point. What giveth? The OED tells us. In 1611, the phrase making a difference could mean to draw a distinction between two or more things, to treat two or more things differently to one another. The King James has Leviticus telling readers to make a difference between the unclean and the clean. And this is actually cited here in the OED. This sense is not marked as obsolete because I think when it's followed by between, people still understand it to mean make a distinction. But in Jude 22, it's not followed by between. On some have compassion, making a difference. This meant to the King James translators, on some have compassion, drawing a distinction. Treat different sinners differently, in other words. The King James translators expected readers to understand this phrase, and I think language change is the reason that we don't anymore. At the very least, the sense of the phrase making a difference, that means to have a positive, beneficial effect on a person, thing, or situation, to change something for the better, that sense did not enter English until 1917, according to the OED. So the King James translators could not have meant that, and they didn't have to guard against that possible interpretation of these words. Matthew Henry understood this. Centuries ago, he wrote in his commentary on this verse, We must distinguish between the weak and the willful. Of some we must have compassion, treat them with all tenderness, restore them in the spirit of meekness, not be needlessly harsh and severe in our censures of them and their actions, nor proud and haughty in our conduct towards them. Others, here's the distinction, others save with fear, urging upon them the terrors of the Lord, endeavor to frighten them out of their sins, preach hell and damnation to them. Matthew Henry nailed it. That's what the King James translators were trying to communicate. And that's the fifth false friend starting with D in this video, and false friend 92 on my list of 50 false friends in the King James. Before I say now, hopefully thou understandest what thou readest in the King James a little better, I want to draw a little application here. There are King James onlyists out there who deserve harsh and severe treatment. Peter Ruckman is one of them. Gail Ripplinger is another. Sam Gipp. Those are King James leaders on the extreme wing, and I think that they deserve to be rebuked harshly. I have done so on occasion on this channel. But the vast majority of people who are confused by the existence of multiple modern English Bible translations, who are confused and intimidated by the differences among Greek New Testament manuscripts and Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts, they are people with whom you ought to have compassion and patience. I think you ought to make a difference between those leaders who are hardened in their sin and who have been given opportunity to know better and still are leading the church into falsehoods and into divisiveness, contention, and strife. And those people like me, like I was as a teenager, and like my teachers and my pastor were, who were just trying to be faithful and were guilty of the same sin we're all guilty of. They were guilty of being finite. In other words, they were not guilty. They did not know what they were saying was wrong. We need to make a distinction between different kinds of sinners, even in the King James debate. And now, hopefully, thou understandest what thou readest in the King James Version a little better.